In this video, we're going to talk about allyship. It's often mentioned as an aspect of creating cultures of inclusion and belonging, and I'm excited to learn more about it. That's coming up now. Hi there, I'm Andrea Adams, the host of HR Shop Talk. On this show, you get expert insight into anything that has to do with HR. I encourage you to subscribe to the show or podcast to keep learning from my guests. Today, my guest is Emily Williams. Emily's based out of Chicago and coaches women of color to advocate for themselves. She's built global DEI programs and policies and consults with organizations to create cultures of allyship. Hi, Emily. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing great, Andrea. Thanks. How are you?
I'm good. And I am actually excited to learn more. I was involved in a minor-ish DEI effort a long time ago, and we talked about allyship, but never really went anywhere. So let's just start at the very, very beginning. What is an ally?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, an ally is someone who, one, understands that things are inequitable in our world, in our societies, and certainly in our workplaces. And then they match that understanding with action that helps to address those inequities, right? So things like naming bias or advocating for people of color, women of color, others with marginalized backgrounds and identities, for them to have visibility, advocating for them to have opportunities to advance in the workplace, and to become visible, right, in society.
Right. You know, I love that idea, but for many who are in more privileged backgrounds, that can be threatening because it sounds like they're going to lose opportunity, right?
Absolutely.
What's your take on that?
Well, I think number one, we have to look at that. We have to come from a place of abundance, right? That there's enough for everyone. And part of our advocacy also needs to be that there are enough resources for everyone, right? We have systems set up in place right now that thrive on scarcity, that say, that pride themselves on individualism, right? That only one person can make it to the top, right? We only have enough, our work systems are set up such that there's one manager, right? But there actually are other systems that we could put in place in other ways of working that we could advocate for, which are really based in equality, right? So what would it look like to have a horizontal reporting structure, right? Or a team environment that actually prioritizes people over productivity. So when we shift our thinking and our ideas about the systems that guide our culture of work, then we can see that we don't have to have those scarcity models, right? That there really can be enough for everyone, and that we don't have to necessarily compete with one another to accomplish the same goal.
We talked about what an ally is. I think a lot of times people will say, I'm an ally, but maybe they're not. So what is not allyship?
Yeah. There's actually research that supports that point. It's about 3/4 of white employees consider themselves allies to women of color, yet they do not participate in the actions that would demonstrate allyship. So like I mentioned earlier, naming bias when they see it, advocating for women of color to have opportunities to advance within the workplace. I think, first of all, it's really important to understand that allyship as a category is something that is mutually agreed upon. So I think a lot of people want to think, okay, well, I'm a good person. Everyone is welcome here. I really want to embrace people of all identities, all backgrounds. Therefore, I'm an ally. But it takes much more than that, right? Okay. And it is about these things of demonstrating our allyship. So if you consider yourself an ally, when is the last time that you named bias at work? When is the last time that you passed up an opportunity for advancement because there was another woman of color or person of color or someone with a marginalized identity, and you advocated for them to have the opportunity instead, right? When was the last time that as an ally, you came up with a new possibility for a new way of working that actually isn't based in hierarchy, right? Where we know that the majority of those who are at the top, cis white men, are at the top, right? As an ally, when's the last time that you seriously thought about an alternative to that structure, right? So someone who is an ally has to demonstrate their allyship through these concrete actions that actually do work to create new structures in which inequality is not central, or advocating for women of color, people of color, others with marginalized identities to have more visibility, to have more access to the privilege, to the resources. And there is a fair amount of that is, one, understanding one's own access to privilege, and in many cases, checking that privilege, right? So that also means things like not always taking up space, right? Yeah. So we have to create space for others to have opportunities as well as an ally.
Right. I would add too, though, giving that opportunity and creating those opportunities, it's good for the company. Like, how much talent is being missed out on because they're not the right color, they're not the right gender, they're not, they don't speak English the right way. It's actually to the organization's advantage to create those opportunities for people who are otherwise marginalized.
Well, I would just add to your last point that, companies who identify as more diverse and inclusive are 35% more likely to outperform their competitors, and diverse teams are 87% better at making decisions, right? So, when we are demonstrating allyship, when we're advocating for the women of color, people of color, other people with marginalized identities, to be able to be their full selves at work, to have space, access, and visibility at work, you're absolutely right. It is better for the company, and it's a better way of working, right? Our teams function better. And it also, and I know this anecdotally from the companies that I consult with and the women I coach, it also feels much better to be at work, right? And when we're happy at work, we perform much better.
Yes, of course. So what do you think is holding people back from being actual allies, which means taking some action?
Yeah. Well, I think you mentioned it before. I think it's this notion that, look, those of us who are in the workforce, so many of us have worked hard, right? We've gone to school, we've gotten our degrees, we've worked overtime to get noticed, to perform. And so we all feel entitled to get that promotion, right? And also our culture of work has really reinforced that sense of entitlement, right? And again, it's also based in individualism, that you work hard to get to the top, right? And there's only room for a few at the top. So that's been deeply ingrained in our culture, and that's been internalized by many people who are in today's workforce. And so I think that spirit of competitive competition, that notion of individualism, that notion of individual merit, right? And reward, I think really does prevent people from demonstrating allyship.
Right.
I think also, some people are very clear that they have benefited from an unequal system, right? I mean, when you think about what's the incentive, and I don't want to characterize all of any group, but when that people who look like you, talk like you, think like you, come from similar backgrounds like you, often get to the top, there's zero incentive to change that system, because you benefit, right? So when we're talking about allyship, there really does need to be a different perspective, and it does need to be based in collectivism, right? And equality. Because if one's going to only prioritize their privilege, their benefit, and they're currently benefiting from the system, then allyship is not likely to result from that that mindset, right? That set of priorities.
Mm-hmm. I do think that, I do actually think that many leaders would be compelled by the idea that they're, that of the amount of talent they're missing out on if it's only white, cisgender men who are making it to the top. I mean, that excludes probably 60% of the population. I don't know. It depends on where you live, but I mean, that's a lot of talent going untapped.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But maybe it's naive of me to think that that is actually might be.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I mean, I think a lot of people act in their own personal interest, and they've been taught that that's the right thing to do. Actually, individualism is a value. And so, things have been actually quite slow to change. These diversity statistics actually aren't new, right? And, diversity, equity, and inclusion has been a thing since, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the United States, right? So that's been a long time of the understanding that, we have actually a right to a workplace that is free from discrimination. Again, I think at the core of effective allyship, demonstrative allyship, is advocating for new structures in which everyone truly can be included. And I think when we look at it from that perspective, those who benefit from the status quo are likely to be reluctant to that change.
If you found this eye-opening, subscribe and comment. What examples of allyship have you seen in action? Let us know in the comment section. So expanding to more sort of this HR sphere, which is the focus of my channel, how can we incorporate the concept of allyship into our DEI efforts?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think they should certainly be in the DEI efforts. But I think, and this is what I advocate for in my consulting work, I think that they should be worked into all elements of the organizational culture, right? Even outside of our DEI programs. And really, I think one way that's really important is that we have to build it into our expectation of leadership, right? So again, leadership is not getting to the top at all costs. It's not, working 20 extra hours a week so that you can get ahead. No, leadership is about recognizing the others who are on your team, right? Supporting and elevating the contributions of others on your team. It's about building diverse teams and fostering their success, right? Mm-hmm. It's about having a set of policies that actually are responsive to the needs of people of diverse backgrounds and diverse identities, right? Mm-hmm. And it's having that as a consideration from the beginning, right? So I think that allyship actually needs to extend well beyond our diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging programs.
I have a question. A question for you. So, and I know there's, a lot of debate about this. So what's your take on how we should measure our success in DEIB? I mean, I'm getting a little off topic of allyship, but what's your take on that? How do we know that we're making progress?
I think there are many ways that we can measure our success. And I think we have to do them in multiple ways, right? I think, if we're looking at hiring and retention, then I think it's clear the data that we look at, right? Mm-hmm. We can tell, okay, how many diverse candidates of diverse backgrounds do we have that we're interviewing, and how many of them have we hired? What salaries are we paying them, right?
Yes.
All of those processes equitable. I think the other thing that often is missed is longevity, right? I think there still is a trend that diversity, equity, and inclusion can be kind of this passing thing. It's somewhat trendy. We have to be on trend when it's trending. When it's not, then we don't need to necessarily be so accountable to those goals, right? But longevity is really important, right? Because to truly build a culture of allyship, a culture where diversity, equity, and inclusion is modeled and fully valued, that takes time, right? That it actually does not happen overnight, okay? And the formula can be simple, but in order for us to really build these cultures, these organizational cultures, it takes time, right? So I think that's another important way that we measure. And I think it's also about like how robust are our DEI efforts, and is our DEI program, right? Is it that we do an annual training, or is it that, okay, every single week we're addressing these topics, right? And we have real dialogue, we go back and forth, and not only our workplace culture, practices, and policies changing, but so too we see our employees changing, right? They have new perspectives about who they are, about who their coworkers are. And then as a result, we really ought to see a shift in the way that the organization understands itself and its work.
Where do you think ERGs, employee resource groups, fit into this?
Yeah, I mean, I think they can be a really important component of allyship. I think it first and foremost, I think ERGs really ought to create a space for an affinity space, we might say, right? Where people of particular groups, many of them marginalized, can come together and feel a sense of belonging in that space, talk about the issues which most impact them.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's important that ERGs are protected for that purpose and that purpose alone. But also that then should, feeling that kind of belonging, feeling that sense of safety in that affinity space ought to make it safer or more okay or more of a norm to then advocate for other groups, right? It should, in theory, lessen the divisions between groups in a workplace.
So why? I mean, I was just curious about this. I've been hearing so much about being an ally, and then I referred to that project I was on a long time ago. Why do you think it's important for people out there, for HR, to learn about allyship?
Well, one, a lot of harm happens at work. And this is very true in the women who I coach. When it comes to things like microaggressions, failure to be promoted, receiving unjust performance review, to outright sexual harassment, other forms of harassment and discrimination. Those things can cause trauma in the workplace. Those things can cause real mental, physical, and emotional harm to people in the workplace. So I think first and foremost, that's important. And I think human resources really ought to show up for the employees, right? And ensure that employees are well, healthy, and safe at work. And allyship is a part of that, right? I also think, we're in this time, whether you want to call it the Great Resignation, the Great Awakening, the Great Reckoning, whatever you want to call it. Right? The majority of employees are rethinking the impact of work on their personal lives, on their personal well-being. So if we want to continue to build a future of work where employees want to come to the office, where they're excited to be part of a culture, where they're excited to be part of a company, they're going to need to feel like the company has their back, right? And allyship is a huge part of that. Right.
Yeah.
So I think those are the two main components right now.
Okay. So if someone wants to learn more about either being an ally or creating a culture of allyship in their organization, where would you suggest they go?
Well, I would suggest that they email me directly and download the one pager and learn more about the programs that I offer about building a culture of allyship.
Okay. That's fairly straightforward. I will add those links in the description of the episode, as well as like below where we're talking. Thanks, Emily. That was unfortunately necessary and challenges those of us who have some power to maybe act a bit differently. I did an episode on HR trends in 2022, and DEI was in that, but maybe not in a way you'd expect. And the link to that episode's right here. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.